Hello and welcome to the Tabled by Two podcast. This is the weekend Warhammer wrap up, where I'll go through the 4-1 and 5-0 results, show you a few lists, read out some data, and get you more up to speed with what's happening in the world of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. I'm Lachlan, let's get started. So if we look here, we'll see all the armies that scored 4-1 and 5-0 results over the past weekend, right? Up at the top is Daughters of Cain. Not very surprising. 2 5-0s, 4 4-1s, incredibly strong army. We'll get more into them later. Same with Ossiarch Bone Reapers in second. Then you've got Stormcast. I think they're still really good, right? As a Stormcast player myself, I think that they're in a really great place in the meta right now. I'll get into it a bit more later, but they're just really good. They have a lot of tools that can help them fight a lot of matchups, and if you play them well, you'll get a lot out of them. Next is Maggotkin of Nurgle. Bogeyman of sorts over this year. Just puts an absurd amount of wounds on the table. Probably too much, but they just get so many wounds on decent saves with wards or minuses to hit and wound. They're just oppressive to fight against. Then you've got Ogres. Kind of a wild card, right? Currently, don't have a battle tome, still playing with their index, but they put a decent amount of wounds on the table and they hit really hard, right? Iron Guts hit like trucks. They just have a lot of strengths, right? I'm not super familiar with them. I'll get more into them in a future episode. Next is Lumineth. The perennial best army in the game, right? Like, is there ever a point in which Lumineth isn't good? But they have a lot of tools right now. I'll get into them later. They're very strong. Next is Slaves. Slaves is one where, while you might look at the overall win rate of Slaves and say, well, they're much worse than Tzeentch or Sylvaneth or Flesh Eater Courts or some of the other armies that are either at the same tier or below them. I am looking at a weekend by weekend basis. This is a very small sample size of data, right? There isn't a ton of 4-1-5-0 results to go around. So sometimes a really good player can just go on a good run and get a solid result with a faction. And a couple of players have done that here with Slaves, and I congratulate them for it, right? So that's what that is. On to Flesh Eater Courts. Still incredibly strong, right? Like, they have a lot of tools. Recursion, they hit pretty hard. Like, Crypt Guard and Crypt Horrors and all those units are really solid. And even if the Terrorgeist builds took a hit, they needed to take a hit. And I think that we'll see other stuff shine. Like, that book is not dead in the water. It's still really good. Sylvaneth and Tzeentch are both new battle tomes, right? And there's a clear difference, right? If you read these battle tomes, they feel different to the ones released last year and the year before, right? They have more tools, they feel just generally stronger, but it's more tools, right? Like, I think it's less about raw power and more that you just have more options, right? This is true of Tzeentch, this is especially true of Lumineth. They're both books that give you a lot of things to do, right? And a lot of ways to keep you in the game. Like, if you have stuff that you can be doing, you can be progressing your board state, you can be like denying your opponent tactics or slowing your opponent down. You can just be in the game for longer, and that gives you more opportunities to win. It's hard to count out a Lumineth or Tzeentch player. Next is Skaven. One of the early battle tomes along with Stormcast, right? In terms of win rates, they're sort of struggling right now. I think there's an element of Skaven players just trying to find what's good. I think armies can go through transitional periods where a certain list will be doing very well for quite a while, and with Skaven that was sort of the Screaming Bell Rat Ogres list, and I think you can still get a lot of success with that list, but competitive players can be fickle. They can get bored of a list. They want to try and find something new. And like Skaven, there might be problems with the faction. I'm not denying that, but it can be in a transitional state. And I think Skaven is in that transitional state. between sort of what was good and what they want to find out is good next. And depending on how the obscuring rules change in the next General's Handbook, we could see a rise in Skya shooting lists, with all those stuff going down in points in the last battle scroll, and I think the shooting stuff being really good in Skaven. You got Blades of Corn and Soulblight. Blades of Corn, since the December battle scroll where they got their battle traits buffed up quite a bit, they're in a good spot, right? Like, I think with the way that Blood Drenched worked previously, it was very clunky and did not go off very often, right? Like, having to have half of all units in the game die is a big ask and wasn't really achievable. It was pretty tough. And at that point, like, by the time you got that buff, it wasn't enough, right? If the buff came from you killing a lot of your opponent's stuff, well, like, it really needs to come from both sides trading. And it just wasn't enough of a late game push to really, like, catapult you into the end game, right? What it felt like it wanted to be was, here's a big buff you get at the end of the game to really push you through, right? You've lost some stuff, your opponent's lost some stuff, and you're going to get an advantage. But it didn't really play that way, and now getting it more frequently when you score Blood Tithe is really good. And it'd be remiss not to talk about Baleful Lords, right? The 5 Bloodthirsters, incredibly strong, made worse in the previous battle scrolls, so we'll see how that affects it. Soulblight, a strong army. Like, I think they have a lot of tools. I say that a lot of tools, but, like, they do. They have strong units, a lot of really strong heroes. They do play into the vampire stuff really hard, but skeletons have become a lot better, I think, with the points drops on both Baronites and Barrow Guard. We'll be seeing a lot of those going into the future. Next is cities. They're in a weird spot, but their battle tome is on the way, right? They got a battle tome on the way. It's hard to look too hard in the cities right now. Games Workshop isn't looking super hard in the cities right now. They're just in a holding pattern, right? They were really strong at the start of this current General's Handbook, got nerfed quite a bit, and now are sort of in a waiting state. Nighthaunt got an incredibly poorly received battle tome, right? They lost a lot of their faction identity for what became sort of fast Nurgle almost. So we'll see. Nighthaunt, the Pie Guy spam list were really good, and then they've been nerfed, and I think Nighthaunt players are finding out what they want to run, or whether they even want to run the faction at all. Nighthaunt are interesting. And then finally, Gits, right? I have a lot of opinions on Gits, but as it comes down to it, they do struggle. They're not as strong as they have been in the past. They lost a lot of or a few of their very possibly considered feels bad tech pieces, like the Sunsteel Wheelers getting worse. I still think they're really good, but point stands and a few other things, we'll see. Like, Gits are in a weird spot. Their battle traits are very bad, and they're having to play without that. Like, having to perform in spite of having poor battle traits. That's why you see a lot of squig lists. They can just put a lot of wounds on the table that do decent enough damage, and maybe that's how they're going to win. But we'll see. We'll talk more about Gits in future episodes, I'm sure. I'll get my Gits friends on to talk about that. So we're going to go through some lists. And I'll start with the power picks. These are my sort of meta lists that I think you should look at, and talking about things you should look out for within those lists, right? To know how to beat them, or to know if you're playing these armies, how to use them, maybe. Yeah, so that's what it is, the power picks. I'll start with Daughters of Cain here, right? This list run by Calvin. It went 4-1. So Daughters of Cain Fervent Ritualist lists. It has Master Pass and Restless Energy. Those are the two most common battle tactic card combinations. They're the most all-round. You've got Lord of Shadows, Prayers of the Cainite Cult. I'm not going to go through all that stuff for every list. But you've got Marathi Cain, the Shadow Queen, 20 Blood Sisters, 5 Life Takers, Slaughter Queen, some Sisters of Slaughter, Shadow Stalkers, and a Hag Queen with Murderous Duelist. So going through this list, you've got Marathi, who is just incredibly strong, right? Marathi does a lot for a DOK list, and you want that for a unit that costs 700 points. And then under that, you've got Blood Sisters, right? They're just incredibly solid. The book used to feel very split in half between sort of elves and snakes, and that feels like it's lessened, right? There's less of a divide between the elves and snakes. This is more of a snake build in terms of that its main hammers are snakes. But you can do more with elves if you want to do that. A few things I'll point out before I get into my sort of deep dive on Marathi, if you like, is Witch Brew. Being able to make your guys ethereal, right, ignoring negative modifiers to save rolls, is incredibly strong. Daughters of Cain are a very squishy army, and anything you can do to increase their tankiness is, like, really helpful. And especially on units like Sisters of Slaughter that have the -1 hit and wound against them, that makes them very tanky. Then the Murderous Duelist on the Hag Queen, right? It's a reasonably innocuous ability, but it really helps. It can really help in your early game Blood Right blessing generation, right? You really want to get that first blessing quickly, right? Because it snowballs from that. And Murderous Duelist can do that because it can force your opponent to fight the Hag Queen, especially if the Hag Queen is next to another unit, like next to some Sisters of Slaughter or whatever. You can force them to fight the Hag Queen. And if the Hag Queen was anointed, then it'll die, and then it'll score your blood right. Because you really want to get that +1 to wound blessing. That's really that's your weakness, right? It's weakness for a lot of elf armies is that wound on 4s. And Daughters of Cain is no exception, and being able to wound on 3s is much better, right? A few other things, you've got a lot of good spells, Run and Charge. Mind Razor is still really good, even if it's not as good as it has been in the past. Your prayers are solid. You've got a lot of Shadow Stalkers are a unit that I will particularly point out here. Their ability to teleport from anywhere to anywhere in the in the movement phase, is incredibly strong, right? They're a unit that you can score you a lot of points throughout a game. They're one to keep an eye on. And then finally, the battle formation, actually. I'll bring up Fervent Ritualists. Just a bit of model recursion is pretty helpful. But I'll go into Marathi. So, this is my deep dive, if you like. It's not really a deep dive. My sort of quick overview of Marathi here. So Marathi is 2 units, right? You've got the Shadow Queen, which is Mega Marathi, the big snake, and then Marathi Cain herself, which is the little wizard dude. They're incredibly strong, right? And there's a few different abilities here that I wanted to point out. Now, this is not the entire War Scrolls of either of the units, not even close. Marathi Cain is a 3-cast wizard that does... It's just a 3-cast wizard, and you've got really good spells, especially on manifestations. I do want to point out, Daughters of Cain has some incredibly strong manifestations that do a lot of damage. They can actually do quite a bit of damage. And then the Shadow Queen is just a really solid combat monster, right? Just pretty solid. And these are the abilities I wanted to bring up for both of them. So first, you got the Iron Heart of Cain. This is on Marathi Cain's War Scroll, Mini Marathi. Whenever you perform a blood rite, you get to do an ability. And they're quite strong. The most powerful being it allows the Shadow Queen to use a normal move or retreat. This is a hotly debated ability in terms of how it works, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm running on the World's ruling that you can do multiple core abilities in a phase. So, at least for the purposes of this ability. So, we're not going to get into that. But that's incredibly strong, and the other abilities are also really good. Being able to teleport Marathi, healing, they're all quite strong. And getting blood rights, once you've scored the first one, it can be very easy to start scoring multiple. Or for your opponent to be scoring them for you, right, in terms of killing your units. It's just, it can snowball, right? Next is the 2 bodies, 1 soul ability. Um, if you've scored 3 blessings in a game, you get a replacement Shadow Queen, right? It could also be a replacement Marathi Kane, but it's most likely going to be a replacement Shadow Queen, and that's incredibly strong, right? We see a similar ability on Alaria the Ever Queen, and she's also a very strong unit. You know, just giving yourself an extra, you got a whole nother unit, right? Replacing your best monster again. It's really strong. And then finally, Surge of Hatred. It allows you to possibly fight in the hero phase with the Shadow Queen, which can be very strong, or just do a bit of mortal wounds. I'll also point out that with the 2 bodies, 1 soul ability, you don't have to set up either Shadow Queen or Marathi, depending on which one you bring back, outside of combat. So you can, if set up in the right way, set up Marathi inside of combat and then immediately cast the Fight in the Hero phase spell. Incredibly strong. Daughters are an army that hit really hard, and I think people are learning how to fight against them. I think Daughters will have really bad matchups, just like anyone, but they're incredibly squishy. They really don't like shooting. But I think the snake builds, and especially something like this, with being able to recur your snakes, or like return models to your snake units, and then snakes just being 3 wounds apiece with Witch Brew, they can be pretty tanky. So I think we'll see the Daughters meta expand. I don't think Marathi is a much must pick. I think you can do a lot of things without her, but this was just the list I decided to highlight. And next I'll move on to this list by Jesus. It's a Lumineth Realmlords War Hosted Duality list. It's got Alania and Elethor with the Light of Eltharion, Reinforced Sentinels, Reinforced Wardens, Reinforced Dawn Riders, an Enlightener with the Silver Wand and the Scourge of Garan Flawless Commander, a Lord Regent, and a unit of Wardens. Reinforced. What I want to bring up is just you've got a decent amount of bodies on the table. You've got all your debuffs you can get through the rune system that is just incredibly strong. And while it might seem daunting at first, I think it's simpler than it looks. You've just got to know what they can pick based on what they've already picked, right? There's only so many options they can sort of go to. And if you know the key ones, like there's a few, like the -1 to wound from having River and Mountain, or the 3-inch move from having River and Wind. Those sort of abilities you've got to keep track of. But yeah, it is a complicated rule, but not impossible to learn. Going through this list, you've got Alania and Elethor. They're 2-cost wizards. They can also be quite potent combat pieces late in the game. They do quite a bit and are just really solid. Also, Total Eclipse, their War Scroll spell, making it so you have to spend extra command points, is really good. And even if it doesn't like stop your opponent from using the command ability, it might mean they can't use a different one later, or it might make them not do it, right? If you tell your opponent that's going to cost you an extra CP, they might not do that rally or that covering fire or something that like they were just going to normally would just throw out there, but now have to think about it a little harder. So it's really solid. Light of Eltharion I'm going to get into later. So then we got Sentinels. Incredibly solid shooting unit. They do really great shooting damage. They're just great. Sentinels are great. They've got so much range if you want them to. They're just really good. Then you've got Wardens, right? Wardens combo really well with the Venari Lord Regent. I'll get into that later. And also, you just get a decent amount of bodies, right? With the debuffs, they can be pretty tanky. With your Spell Lord, you can give them a 5-up ward. They could be -1 to hit or wound, depending on what runes you've depicted. Their ability that shuts off charge +1 damage is really good, especially into, as we mentioned before, DOK, as that's how Mind Razor works these days, is it gives them charge +1 damage rather than just straight +1 damage. But I'm not going to go too hard into specific matchups. Dawn Riders are just a solid cavalry unit. They do decent enough damage, and they're pretty fast. And then you've got the Enlightener. It's a 2-cast wizard. It's got +1 to cast from the Silver Wand, and Flawless Commander gives you a 12-inch aura of +2 to move. So your army can be reasonably mobile, actually, considering you're a bunch of foot sloggers. Then going to the War Scrolls, right? Light of Eltharion here. The one ability you've really got to look out for is the Valorous Intervention ability. It allows him to remove himself from the battlefield and set him up in combat with another Lumineth unit, right? He can join Lumineth units in combat. Teleporting into combat, basically. It's incredibly strong. His unit that hits quite hard. He can be a bit swingy, but when he hits hard. And having him in any combat on the battlefield is really strong. It's not always an offensive ability, right? It's also a very good defensive tool. It's a threat of activation. If your opponent charges any of your units, they're going to get Eltharion, right? That's a possibility that he could join and he could do a bunch of damage. And then you're going to have to decide how you split your attacks. And Eltharion, with a 3-up save and 4-up ward, and any debuffs you could give within Lumineth, is hard to kill. Like, you have to put resources into him. I think it's very easy to see someone say hard to kill, and I don't think it means he's impossible. He dies. Like, he will die, but you have to put in a lot of resources, and those resources could have gone into something else, and now you've spread them to Eltharion, and if you fail, then he's just going to get to hit back, and his unit you have to really play against to understand, but also he's incredibly strong. Manifestations really hurt him, because if you can lock him up with manifestations, then he just can't get anywhere. Especially like Shackles is a good one that could like lock him up, but otherwise he's incredibly strong, and you really got to think about him. Going forward, the Venari Lord Regent. I really want to point out the Wall of Blades ability here. So it picks a Warden within 12, wholly within 12, and you pick an enemy unit in combat with your Wall of Blades Warden's unit. And for each Warden that is within 3 inches of an enemy unit, on a 5, you roll a dice. On a 5-up, you'll do a mortal. What this really does is just a decent amount of like impact mortals, right? You charge into a unit of Wardens, and you're going to get swung back at, right? You're going to get a bit of damage. Same with Warden. The Wardens can also unit on the charge as well. One thing I'd like to point out is that you can avoid this. You can try not to pile super deep into a unit of Wardens. And if you're charging them, I'd maybe consider spraying out. So you put one unit with your 1/2 inch to confirm the charge, but the rest of the unit can actually doesn't have to be within 1/2 inch. I think it can be very easy to just like charge straight in, and that just doesn't work. Right? Or that will get you punished. So you really want to be trying to avoid Wall of Blades as much as possible. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but it'll do enough to be annoying. And then Shining Example, extra 3 rally dice. Well, not particularly exciting, is still a solid ability to have in addition to the Wall of Blades. You've also got one of your spells is Elemental Push in the Lore of the Awakened Realms that this list was taking. That allows you to move a unit 5 inches. It can also move you out of combat. So you can move out of combat and then rally if you want to rally up your units. And with an additional rally, maybe you'd consider that. On to the next list. We've got a Disciples of Tzeentch list. It's a Mutants and Mad Things list. Which actually, sorry, I want to go back to Lumineth for 1 second and point out Warhost of Duality. Warhost Duality allows you, every time you pick a Lumineth unit to fight, you get to fight with 2 units, one after the other. It's a big part of Lumineth, and it's a big part of what makes them strong, is that your opponent, like, it's really easy for you to set up favorable combats when you can do multiple combats at once. It's almost like being able to strike first or strike last or whatever. Like, you get such flexibility. It's also true with Eltharion activations, right? If Eltharion comes in, him and his buddies will get to fight. Incredibly strong. But back to Tzeentch. It's a Tzeentch Mutants and Mad Things list. It's got a lot of change with the Kyric Tome, 3 Chaos Spawns, an Exalted Flamer, a Curseling, Zangor Enlightened, a Change Caster with the Silver Summoner, 40 blue horrors and 10 pink horrors. Tzeentch does a lot. They're a very heady army, like an ethereal army. Not ethereal in the sense of ignoring modifiers to save rolls, but like they take a lot of thought to play. And playing against them sometimes can feel like it's very hard, right? It's hard to keep track of everything that they've done. The board state in a Tzeentch game can change like that in a hero phase, right? Like, it can completely change. And this list plays in ways that I've seen Tzeentch list play. But few things. Chaos Spawns. Tzeentch is a swip swap mechanic, the Masked by Illusion stuff. Chaos Spawns, you have any number of them, right? If a Chaos Spawn dies, you get another one. You can never run out. Now, if you don't kill the Chaos Spawns, then they will run out. But sometimes it can be hard to do that. Especially with Transpawn to Spawn, one of their spells that allows them to do damage to one of your units, and if a model dies, turn it into a spawn. You're straight in combat with them. It's going to be hard for you to avoid killing it, because they are pretty squishy. But they're annoying enough that they're there, and they're constantly there. They've also got 6 Zangor Enlightened, which are an incredible hammer. They can deal with almost anything in the game. They do so much damage. They're so fast. And then with all your swip swap, Masked by Illusion stuff, they can be very hard to kill. So your opponent can't get to them, can't deal with them. And that's the problem, is that they'll be there, and then they're not, and then they're over here, and then they're not. And then if you can't deal with them, they're just going to run over the game. Then horrors, right? You've just got so many of them. You've got the split and split again, so you just have tons of them like naturally on the board, and then the Lord of Change can recur them. I'm going to talk a bit more about the Lord of Change later. The Curseling and Change Caster are just solid units as well. They do stuff. Their Curseling has got a -1 to save rolls spell that's really good, and the Change Caster gives out ignore critical hits, or I believe other weapon abilities. Yeah, you've just got good shooting damage from the horrors and good melee damage from the enlightened, and then a lot of movement, right? That's really what this does. And I'll go into the Lord of Change. So the big one here is the Summon Demons of Tzeentch. If a demon unit dies, you get one back at half strength. It's just very good. You've got, extra horrors. And you already have a ton of horrors. So just getting more of them is really good. And then the Locust of Impossibility ability. -1 to hit for all your demons means they can be hard to shift. And especially with some of your other defensive abilities you've got, in terms of -1 to wound from the Bolt of Tzeentch, and you can give out 5-up wards with the spell in the Law of Fate that gives it. You've just got a lot of abilities that can debuff. So that ability is really good. -1 hit is really solid, and it's just great. The normal move spell is also pretty good, allowing you to get units places. You just has a lot. And on top of that, 3 cast wizard with +1 to cast. It just does everything you could want, right? I sometimes refer to units as a kitchen sink. Lord of Change is one of those, right? If you're playing a demon-focused build, it's a kitchen sink for that build. It'll do everything you want. Lord of Change is great. It's a great unit. Tzeentch is a great army. They do a lot of stuff really powerfully right now, but you do have to be able to play them. I think that the difference between a good and a bad Tzeentch player will be obvious, and you'll be able to tell. And then Zangor Enlightened, right? Do tons of damage. And the ability to give out either +1 rend or crit 2 hits when they charge is just really strong. Like, crit 2 hits is incredibly strong, right? It increases your damage output by a bunch. I don't need to tell you why crit 2 hits is good. They just hit really hard, right? Damage 3 on the charge. They're just great. Zanger and Lighten are great. 14-inch move. They also are reasonably tanky, especially with all the debuffs you can get out in Zinch, or the 5-up ward. They do a lot. They can get run and charge from the Burning Sigil of Zinch, which is one of your endless spells. They just do a lot. Zanger and Lighten are just great. Here we've got an Osiark Bone Reapers list run by Joshua. They went 4-1. I'm not super familiar with Osiark Bone Reapers, but I've looked into the army for the purposes of explaining it to you. A few things. The Liege Mortek and the Triaxes, you've got to look out for that. Mortek Triaxes are a shooting unit that do pretty good shooting damage. They're sort of similar to Sentinels in that way. Solid shooting unit, and the Liege Mortek allows them to shoot after he fights. So like some units will have a chain activate ability where they'll fight and then their buddies get to fight right after them. He does a similar thing, but the Triaxes get to shoot. That's really strong. You can get a lot of shots out of these Triaxes across a battle round. Combined with that, and covering fire, and whatever else, it's really good. Arkan is a solid spellcaster. He's an okay combat monster. And Curse of Years is a solid spell, right? It can do decent mortal wounds or possibly auto slayer unit. It's pretty fun. And then 4 MSU units of Cavalos Death Riders and the Liege Cavalos. Now, this is what I'm going to get into. And this is what I think the source of the list is. I'm not going to be perfect, right? I'm not always going to find out exactly why the list ticks. I can't figure that out without playing it, but I've got a couple ideas here. And it's Death Riders. They're an interesting unit, right? Because they're a cavalry unit that doesn't really do a ton of damage. They're not great, but they have the Death Rider Wedge ability that allows them to, when they fight, well, instead of fighting, they get to do D3 mortals, do an additional D3 if you've picked a friendly hero, which is the Liege Cavalos, and then they get to move. They get to do a normal move, right? Or they get to move 10 inches. But yeah. Then you've got a couple things that combo with this, right? The big one is the heroic trait, Imperious Will. So if you pick to use this Death Rider Wedge ability, which is a fight ability, you'll get to do 2-up D3 additional mortal wounds on top of your 2D3, right? So you'll pick your enemy unit, you'll pick a Liege Cavalos nearby, and then you'll do all these mortal wounds. And the Liege Cavalos increases their movement from 10 to 12 when doing the Death Rider Wedge ability. And I think what you can do then is you'll charge in your big line of them. It's sort of an alpha pin, right? And I guess an alpha strike, but you'll charge them in, and your Liege Cavalos can sort of pop between the backs of each of these units, right? So they'll hit the first one, or like the first one will do their move, do the damage, do the move, and the Liege Cavalos can then move himself to the next unit and then keep going. Because you're allowed to use the Imperious Will ability multiple times. So you can keep popping along and doing 3d3 mortal wounds to every unit that you've charged into. And you've got good shooting. Then your units are moving away. You've just got you've got some tools, right? You've got all your 5-up wards and other stuff you can give out with your disciple points. OBRs seem like a solid army, right? And this is sort of how they've always been. I think they require a lot more thought to play than they did back in the Index, where you just sort of move your castle up the board and then every turn pick whatever the best ability was out of the 2 abilities, and usually you knew which one you wanted. So now it's got a lot more options, and there's some cool stuff. We'll see how the book evolves. It's still very new. People are still figuring it out. We'll see how it evolves. This is what I think is the reason for MSU Death Riders. Down to my picks, right? These are lists that spoke to me or that I just thought were kind of neat. Still powerful lists, right? Still 4-1 lists, but a bit more interesting. We got Madigan here with a Nighthaunt Deathstalkers list, running Scourge of Goran, Kurdos Valentine, Reinforced Banshees, a Black Coach, the Scourge of Goran version, Reinforced Chain Rasps, Dreadblade Harrow, Krulgast Cruciator, Chain Ghast, 2 units of Dreadscythe Harridans, and then what I thought was interesting was the Mortek Crawler, the Siegebreaker Regiment of Renown, right? It's an interesting pick in a Nighthaunt list. So Nighthaunt, sort of as I said before, they're pretty tanky. They've got tools, right? You've got a teleport, you've got retreat and charge with Deathstalkers. They do some decent damage, actually. Banshees are really solid. The Black Coach is quite good. Reinforced Chain Rasps is fun. Kurdos Valentine is also pretty solid in the damage department. You've got the Krulgast Cruciator knocking off a damage point each phase. Dreadblade Harrows can teleport. Like, they've got some strengths. But I wanted to get into the Mortek Crawler. And this sort of links back into the OBR discussion, right? It is a solid shooting unit. It's got crit 2 hits. It's got D3 plus 2 damage. It doesn't have a ton of rend, but like it hits pretty hard. And then if it shoots something, if all of its attacks target the same unit, this is the Deathly Barrage ability. It has a chance to strike last. And I think in a Nighthaunt list like this, that gets a lot of its damage through Kurdos or the Black Coach, or the Cruciator's got the Tombstone of the Pennant, which allows it to get extra attacks based on how many terrain features you control. You then get a lot of use out of a strike last, because your damage is coming from multiple small sources. So you've got that strike last to get through that damage. And then also just solid range damage on its own. The Osvector is another caster, which can be useful. That's why you've got the Kronspine Incarnate here to cast. Just an interesting list. And I thought the inclusion of the Crawler was very interesting for an OBR list. Oh, Nighthaunt list, sorry. Finally, Stormcast Eternals. I'm a Stormcast player, and this is one that talks to me, speaks to me, right to my heart. It's a Stormcast Eternal Thunderhead host list. It's got Lord Vigilant Gryphstalker, Reinforced Annihilators, 2 Reinforced Grand Hammers, a Lord Imperator with the Shock and Awe heroic trait, a Lord Veritant with the Beacon of Azir, Guard of Steel Soul, Reinforced Prosecutors, Reinforced Vanquishers, Annihilators with Grand Hammers, right? Are a unit that I played back in 3rd edition, and I loved, right? I didn't love them. I got really sick of running them towards the end there, but that's before I switched over to Big One. I'll talk about my Age of Sigmar story in a future episode. Annihilators do a ton of damage, right? And this list, with Annihilators and the Imperator and Gardas, are one mean package that can do a lot of damage very, very quickly. And then your opponents have to deal with the Grand Hammers, right? You're not thinking about, can the Grand Hammers wipe your opponent's entire army? It's, can they do enough to cripple them and then make them deal with the Grand Hammers? Like, they then have to deal with Grand Hammers, or just move around them, because Grand Hammers are quite slow. But there's a couple other things I want to bring out. The Vigilant on Gryphstalker can give your Prosecutors fight twice, which is really strong. Prosecutors hit quite hard, even with Gardas as well. Prosecutors with a Gardas buff are pretty solid. And the 3/6 charge means they can get places. But also Prosecutors turn on your Thunderhead host ability, when if they're next to your Warrior Chamber units, which is pretty much everything in this army except for Prosecutors, you'll give your guys +1 to hit, which is really good. Stormcast can bring a lot of wounds to the table, or a decent amount of wounds to the table, and are pretty tanky. And I think Stormcast tankiness, and tankiness in general, is something you got to think about. Where Annihilators with shields, right, have a 3 wounds each on a 2-up save for 18 wounds on that reinforced unit. You're not thinking about them as these will survive anything that goes into them. You're thinking about it as, this is going to force my opponent to send something useful into them, right? In that, if those Annihilators were a unit of Gryph-hounds on that objective there, your opponent could send almost anything into it and take it off you. But with Shield Annihilators, they have to send something good. Like, they have to put in a decent unit into killing them. And then this is what I want to talk about, is the Beacon of Azir, right? It's a key part of a lot of Stormcast combos. So you've got the Beacon of Azir over here. it allows you to auto chant a spell or a prayer on a 7. And it's most importantly a prayer, right? You give it to your priest and it allows you to auto cast Translocate. Now, a lot of that swappy stuff Tzeentch was doing, this is what Stormcast does. This is how Stormcast does it. Is you can magical intervention and cast Translocate and auto chant it on a 7 and then get your unit out of there. It means you can go in for these Alpha Strike plays with a unit like Prosecutors or possibly Grand Hammers or even like Paladors or Stormdrake Guard. And when they kill that enemy unit or cripple it or whatever they do, you then get them out of there. They're not going to get... You're not overextending because they're not there. Right? And what'll get killed is then your foot hero, your foot priest. Incredibly strong. Stormcasts are incredibly good. I'll talk about some more of the other competitive lists later with Quest of Soulsworn and such. Also, quick mention to Vanquishers. With the points cut they've just got, I think they're pretty good. And if we go into an infantry heavy meta, I think Vanquishers will see a lot of play. So, yeah, that's the wrap up for the weekend. I'll try and do this every week, going through 4 and 5 results and picking out a handful of lists and talking about them in a little more depth. I might get things wrong. Don't crucify me. See you in the next one.